time in New York. I appreciate the love. Okay, so I think Harry Brown was the first one to say it. I've repeated him 100 times since then. History did not begin on September 11, 2001. Now, to hear the politicians tell it, to hear the pro-Israel war party tell it, to hear the TV news tell it, there's nothing in the world that ever took place before September 11, 2001 that has any bearing on what happened that day. You all saw them. Those planes came out of the clear blue sky, and there was no explanation for what happened there other than once you believe in Islam enough, you become a terrible, hateful person bent on destroying things that are good and beautiful. Well, that's just not true. September 11th was, one, revenge for George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton's occupation of the Arabian Desert in order to blockade and bomb Iraq for 10 years. And it was also revenge for American support for the Israeli government in their cruel and perpetual occupation of Palestine and their on-and-off-again wars in Lebanon. In 1996, when bin Laden declared war on the United States, his declaration, and you can read it at the PBS NewsHour website, is titled Declaration of War Against the Americans Occupying the Land of the Two Holy Places. That is the Arabian Peninsula where Mecca and Medina are. It didn't say declaration of war against the Americans who let their daughters go to junior college and participate in primary elections and watch debauchery on HBO late at night. It was, and in fact, when he declared war in 1996, he invited CNN reporters, Peter Arnett and Peter Bergman, and also John Miller from ABC News, and they interviewed Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, and they made it very clear what their war was about. That original declaration of war from 96 goes on and on and on about the innocent Iraqis being basically starved to death by the American blockade, by the United Nations blockade, and of course by the United States from those bases in Saudi Arabia. And he also went on at length about what's now known as the first Horton massacre in Lebanon, since there's been another horrible massacre by the Israelis there since. And he said, how come your blood is blood, but our blood is water? We'll show you. So that was the motivation. They perceived that we were already at war against them by way of supporting their dictators, propping up the kingdoms, the emirs, the sultans, and various so-called presidents of the Middle East who torture their people on behalf of the United States and Israel to keep them in line. And he said, our tactic will be to lure you into a real war. In fact, you can read bin Laden's son, who gave a great interview to Rolling Stone magazine just about 1 year ago. And he said, my father's dream was to replicate the war against the Russians, against the Americans in Afghanistan. We'll lure you in, and then we'll bleed you to bankruptcy. That was the whole plan. He also said, bin Laden's son, in that Rolling Stone interview, that Osama bin Laden was absolutely ecstatic when George Bush and Dick Cheney took office. They had been trying to provoke Bill Clinton into doing something more than firing a few cruise missiles for 4 years straight, and he wouldn't take the bait. But bin Laden correctly intuited that if he could launch a major attack on the United States under George Bush's watch, that these sick, evil, corrupt Republicans would take absolute full advantage, and they'll put the pedal to the metal on the empire and drive it full speed ahead off the cliff. If he can lure us into the Middle East, bog us down, and lead us to bankruptcy, then they can force us out altogether. And only then, they believe, after destroying the far enemy, America, and getting us out of their hair, then they could wage their local jihad against Nazi American Egypt King Fahd in Saudi Arabia, in Saudi Arabia, etc. And so when George Bush and Dick Cheney thought that they were getting away with bloody murder and taking advantage of the September 11th attack, they actually were falling right into the trap. Osama bin Laden was the matador with the red cape, and Dick Cheney was the bull. And now look at us. America, the country, not just our government, the nation, the country, America, our society, is now that bull with a dozen swords in its spine, stumbling and falling, led like they predicted to bankruptcy. So when the War Party says that America was a sleeping giant minding our own business when we were attacked by these terrible Islamist, jihadist terrorists who only attack us because of how horrible their Islam is, they're actually playing right into the trap of the enemy. And they're laying down a premise for the American people to support an endless war that ultimately is at our expense. Now, the substance of this is proven when you just look at what's happened since they took advantage of September 11th. The Israelis did a study in 2005 that said 90% or more of the young jihadists who traveled to Iraq to fight against the Americans, that very, very small percentage of the insurgency known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they were young guys. They weren't veterans of the Afghan war against the Russians. The only problem those guys had was sending these young new recruits to Iraq to suicide bomb marketplaces and American soldiers. They were radicalized by American foreign policy, not by our freedom. In fact, look at every time the FBI entraps some idiot on saying something stupid into an open tape recorder about how he wants to blow something up so they can parade a terrorist case on TV, you'll know if you look in every one of these cases, the informant tells the dude, don't you hate American foreign policy? Don't you hate what the Israelis are doing in Palestine? Don't you hate what the Americans are doing in Iraq and Afghanistan? That's how the FBI informants trick somebody into getting mad enough to say, yeah, okay, let's do whatever your stupid plan is to get the muscle. The FBI doesn't believe that they hate us all freedom, or they should try to use that line occasionally, right? And the bottom line is this. According to Chris Hellman at the National Priorities Project, we have now spent, our government has now spent $8 trillion on the world empire and the national security state here at home since September 11th. That does not include the estimates of the treatment of our soldiers for the rest of their lives. That doesn't include all the opportunity costs of what that money could have been invested in instead. That's just the cost so far, $8 trillion, more than half of our current national debt. And so, I guess to wrap up here real fast, the solution to our problem is to simply call the war off. You know, they told us to get rid of terrorism and we have to overthrow the dictatorships of the Middle East and get a democracy. And then they won't want to target us anymore. Some of us noticed that they were targeting the dictatorships in Iraq, Iran, and Syria, the three countries that we didn't control the dictatorship. And they never wanted a democratic revolution in Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, Kuwait, or Saudi Arabia, or anywhere else. That's because they knew they were lying. But so if we understand that they're lying, if we can solidly refute the premise that more intervention is the only way to protect us from this menace, and we can get to a policy of ramping this thing down and calling it off as soon as possible, we see volunteers for the terror war against the United States dry up. Robert Papen's books, Dying to Win and Coming to Views, has shown how over and over again, suicide terrorists, 95% of all suicide terrorists since 1980 have come from countries being occupied by a foreign power. Look at Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah used to do suicide attacks. They really inaugurated the new era of suicide bombings in the early 1980s. But ever since the single suicide attack. And the same thing goes for anywhere where we've seen suicide bombing in the history of mankind. No one is willing to volunteer to be a suicide bomber unless they really fear for the future of not just their own life, but their entire society. A bunch of white Christians with rifles come and occupy a land on the other side of the world. That is the kind of pressure that it takes to provoke people into suicide attacks. And as Robert Haig's research has shown, in case after case after case, when the occupation ends, the volunteers for the terrorist acts dry up. So that's it. Just call it off. We don't need a war on terror at all. Thank you.
How you doing?
Horton,